Our presenters today are both PhD students in the Second Language Education Program in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction. We have Corey Matthew, who's one of the CARLA Fellows this year, and Anu Gopalakrishnan. And today they're going to talk about mixed methods research in second language education. So please welcome our speakers.
So thank you so much all for being here. I'll say it's a pleasant surprise to see so many faces at the end of the semester, and we hope we can spark some new ideas for you and some conversation about mixed methods and how mixed methods can be taken up in what we're calling second language studies now, because we broadened a little bit to include second language acquisition, and we weren't sure if second language education felt like that encompassed enough in terms of the field that we're looking at. For today's talk, we're going to have sort of 4 separate sections. I'm going to start out giving a little bit of background about mixed methods research in general, talking through some of the paradigms and the designs that are used in mixed methods. And then Anu will transition into talking more about mixed methods and second language studies in particular, and where we see some great opportunities. And then we're going to talk through a research gap that we found through the work that we are doing this semester, and finally introduce a study that we'll be conducting beginning this summer. I should note that what we're presenting here was work that we did over the course of the semester as part of an independent study, and so this is also an opportunity for us to show our learning. So this is a little bit of an educative presentation in that sense of us showing a little bit of what we discovered during our work this semester. So to begin, I want to briefly remind us of some useful terms and philosophies of knowledge. These are terms that we throw around all the time, and as graduate students, I think sometimes we get confused or we misuse them, so we wanted to start a nice groundwork of what some of these big words, how we're using them in this conversation. And so first, ontology. We're describing as the nature of reality or an object of the study. And so ontology is really looking at what something is, and ontology could be an objective reality versus a subjective reality, possibly a positivist perspective versus an interpretivist perspective. And very closely related with ontology, of course, is epistemology, right? And epistemology then is the relationship between the knower and what is known. It's how do we know what we know? And I think we often find that as grad students, we conflate these two in particular, where we'll say epistemology when we mean ontology. So I'm going to try to be careful with what I'm talking about. But epistemology is that idea of are you an observer, or are you able to really access the truth or knowledge as a hard, objective, tangible thing? And do we know by observing, or do we know by asking others of their experience? Those types of questions get into your epistemology. And then finally, methodology is the rationale for choosing the methods that correspond then to your ontology and your epistemology, right? And a big thing with mixed methods research is that at times methodology and methods gets confused in how we talk about mixed methods, which the name itself can be a little bit confusing then. So I want to remind us all that methodology is this broader box on my visual here that's that conceptual framework that helps researchers design their study, right? And your methodology is going to show the assumptions that are built into your epistemology or your ontology. It's all really related, as well as the research question itself is going to reflect your methodology. The methods then are the tools that you use and the techniques to undertake that research question or undertake that research design. And so mixed methods is sort of a misnomer in the way that we're understanding it, because we see mixed methods research as a third methodology. It's not just about mixing methods, it's about mixing paradigms and larger scale, maybe epistemologies or ontologies, as we'll get into. And I bring this up in particular because as we were doing some of our reading, we found at times studies would call themselves mixed method studies, particularly if they were qualitative, and they would say, because we did observations and interviews. And we were reading that, and we were like, but you're still coming at that from the same epistemology, so we're not calling that mixed methods. And so that's an important distinction that comes back into play much later on in our conversation today. So mixed methods, is it a methodology or is it mixing of methods, as I already kind of alluded to? And mixed methods was initially called the third methodological movement, and this comes out of the paradigm wars of the 1990s, right, where there was some really strong heated, I imagine, debates between qualitative and quantitative researchers about how can we know what we know and what do we do with our research. And mixed methods emerged from this in some, or maybe had a reemergence, I'm not sure, from this as really saying, well, no, there's a third way that we could look at this entire conversation. And mixed methods will then allow researchers to both do the exploratory work that we normally associate with qualitative, as well as the explanatory or confirmatory work that we normally associate with quantitative. And it is sometimes seen as bridging these poles between positivism and constructivism. And I'll talk about this more in a second when I get into the different paradigms that are used to do this. But finally, a lot of mixed methods is going to really focus on what's appropriate to the research question. And so you're starting at the question, you're starting at this object of study and thinking about what's most appropriate to answer whatever I'm trying to answer, right? So as we were doing our reading, we came across 4 different worldviews that normally undergird mixed methods. And some of these might be familiar and some might be a little bit new to some of us. But this was interesting to us because one of the big questions that we opened the independent study with was, well, how do you reconcile these really different epistemologies or ontologies? And what we found is that some of these paradigms don't do that. And their answer is really, well, we have a very different way of looking at the world. We have our own epistemology and our own ontology, and mixed methods works for us. So I'm going to try to talk through the 4 of these quickly because we have a lot we want to get to, but they are pretty dense. So I acknowledge that I'm kind of giving you just an introduction to the 4 different paradigms, and then you can read more if you are intrigued. So the first paradigm is pragmatism, and this is the one that we're probably the most comfortable with, or at least familiar with. And pragmatism really came about as a response to the incompatibility thesis that came out of these paradigm wars. And pragmatism then ascribes to what Howe calls the compatibility thesis, and saying, well, you say these are incompatible. I really think there's ways that we can make them compatible and find some common ground. And the way that they do this really is kind of interesting in that they just reject the binary choices. They say, well, first of all, the way that we perceive knowledge is on a continuum with objective and subjective on either ends, and you could fall anywhere on this continuum. But rather than get into this discussion at all, let's just focus on our research question and not worry about this sort of theoretical conversation. And so they really look at the research as a way of answering a practical question, and the research questions then are the stimulus to whatever methods or methodology you're going to choose. And that's sort of the pragmatist worldview as we understood it from our reading. The next paradigm is transformative. And transformative really defines the research as a way of serving political action and individual and community empowerment. And so transformatists see knowledge from research as reflecting the power relationships in society. And they see the goal of research as really teasing apart these multiple realities that exist and that are socially constructed. And so we should use research to always have an end goal of social justice and transformation for those who are marginalized. And what that means for mixed methods then is that we're going to use whatever works for the aim of social justice. And so I especially like this viewpoint of Merton's, where we'll have a qualitative strand that really emphasizes the community practice and is very emic, if you will, of really focusing on what the community needs. And then we'll have a quantitative strand to develop credibility for different stakeholders, which I thought was a very blunt but honest way of this is why we're going to use mixed methods. If we want social change, we know we need to look at things from both strands because we have different audiences. The third paradigm is dialectical pluralism. And this paradigm really focuses on a dialogue between post-positivist and constructivist ideas. And so dialectical pluralism recognizes that there's different worldviews. They acknowledge that there's differences in diversity, and they really emphasize leaning in or digging into that diversity to put your data or your theories in dialogue with one another. They believe that any one tradition provides only a partial perspective, and so why not use more than one tradition is sort of the idea, and put them in dialogue and lean into the tension that occurs there. And so, as Johnson says, you'll combine ideas from competing paradigms to form a third new workable whole with which you'll look at your data or look at your research question. And as I said, it's really all about this dialogue and leaning into these tensions. And then and I felt that this quote was helpful to explain this, because I had a little trouble understanding what does this actually look like, and we didn't really find studies that use this in a useful way, so I'm still not quite sure what this actually looks like. But Green describes this as a dialectic stance, seeks not so much convergence or as insight, the generation of important understandings and discernment through the juxtaposition of different lenses, perspectives, and stances. And so that ties very nicely into mixed methods. Finally, critical realism is interesting, I found, in that those who believe in critical realism have a very different ontology, really, than how I have experienced from a quantitative or a qualitative perspective, which is that reality is composed of 3 layers. And so the top layer is what we can see, it's our empirical, and then way at the bottom, the 3rd layer, are what they call the real layer, or these generative mechanisms and structures, and then there's a middle layer that are the events generated by these mechanisms. So even what we see is not actually what's happening, and even that is created by something that's underneath. I should say I did not uncover any studies that use this as a model in second language studies, so I'm really not sure how this is operationalized. But the idea is that you can adopt both quantitative and qualitative methods depending on how you ontologically conceptualize the object of your study to get at these different layers, whatever they might be. I just threw the onion up here because that's the only way I can understand this, is the layers of an onion, if, as Shrek likes to talk about. So that was very quick, and so I'd like to summarize these 4 paradigms, just highlighting how then they're each going to take up mixed methods in particular. And so pragmatism is going to be looking for the practical question, right? It's mixed methods if that's what's most practical for what you're trying to answer. Transformative is trying to transform that power structure, so mixed methods if it's going to get us to social change. Dialectical pluralism is purposefully leaning into these tensions between the methods or the methodologies. And then critical realism is trying to deal with contextual factors and the relevant theories to find all these different layers of your object of study. Okay, so all of this said, these are still the paradigms, right? These are still our different ontologies or epistemologies. What does this actually look like in practice? We're getting there. The next step is to think about the purposes for mixed methods. And so this is at a study level. Why do you conduct any given study regardless of your epistemology or sometimes related to? I'm going to talk through these real fast for the nature of time. But essentially there's 5 different purposes that were outlined in the readings that we were working through. The first is triangulation, which has 2 different meanings. One is how we think about triangulation sometimes in qualitative work, where we're going to be collecting different data in order to corroborate and find convergence. That's one way we think about triangulation. But some authors have also argued that triangulation in mixed methods is really trying to find a deeper meaning. And so you're not necessarily looking for corroboration in your different strands, but you're trying to triangulate around an object of study in order to understand it more deeply. Complementarity is looking at, once again, the layers of the construct. And so this ties in really nicely with the last 2 perspectives that I was talking about, in the sense that a complementarity study is going to view an object of the study as having different aspects or different layers. So you're going to have different strands of your study in order to get at different layers of whatever that object of study is. Initiation studies are where a researcher has found some contradictions or paradoxes in the data already. And so this could be possibly you've been reading through the literature and you're looking at a certain construct, and qualitative findings say one thing, quantitative findings say the other. And so you're going to then look at that maybe in the same population but with 2 strands in order to try to figure out what's going on with these paradoxes. Or you've started a study and you're already finding in your analysis some paradoxes. And so then you might bring in another strand in order to initiate that mixed methods to look at it from a different way. Finally, developmental studies are sequential strands, where you're going to be purposefully first doing one strand, maybe qualitative, in order to inform your quantitative strand, and then maybe to inform another strand. And so they happen one at a time. And then finally, an expansion is where you're going to have 2 or more parallel strands. And when we say strands, it's usually quant and qual, right? But they really never converge. And this is actually where I would say the biggest critique of mixed methods comes in, because this is also the most common type of mixed method studies and it's the easiest, right? You're going to just collect your qualitative data, you're going to collect your quantitative data. You'll come up with something at the end, but you're not really integrating your inferences. And the scholars that we've read who write about mixed methods have said we need to try to move away from this. This is not really what we're talking about when we want to be doing mixed methods work, but it is quite common in how we think about mixed methods. Okay, and so the last thing that I want to talk about very briefly, I've already touched on it a little bit, is that when we talk about the designs of mixed methods, we're often talking about these purposes I just discussed and then time. Is it concurrent or is it sequential in how you're collecting and analyzing your data? And Riazi, who wrote this book that I recommend that if you're interested, you can come up and take a look at it at the end, has two different tables that helps me understand kind of how these relate. And so on the side, we have the 5 purposes that I was just talking about. And then across the top, you have your different time scopes. And so mixed method studies can be designed where your strands are concurrent, they're happening at the same time, sequential, right, one after the other, or fully integrated, where really throughout the entire process, you're methodologically and epistemologically integrating across your data. Conversion, the one I skipped, Riazi discusses as where you collect 2 different types of data and then change their form. So you quantize qualitative data and qualitize quantitative data. And we didn't see that very much. And as you can see, he really says you would only do that for an expansion study, which we're trying to move away from anyways. But the second table that I think really kind of nails it all home for me is when you're thinking about if you're integrating your data, if you're integrating your inferences, or if you're keeping them separate, right? And so each of these different types of studies, each of the different purposes, will be played out in different ways in terms of time, if they're concurrent or sequential, and then how well you're really integrating your inferences and your data across those different times and across the different strands. And so Riazi really says we got to get more complementarity studies. That's the gold standard. And if you remember, that's the one that looks at different layers of an objective study at the same time. And so then you're going to be collecting concurrent data that's fully integrated in the way that you're thinking about your data throughout the entire study. But he also reminds us that it's the most challenging because there's a lot of different skills and epistemologies you have to be able to hold at the same time to conduct this type of work. So all of this was to give you a little bit of an overview or a background of where mixed methods actually is. And I think I'll just say that for me, coming at this kind of cold, and I hope for some of you, it helped me realize that it's a lot more nuanced, complex, and well thought out by some authors than we sometimes think about when we critique mixed methods as saying, well, I'm just going to throw this all together. That's often how it's done, but authors who are writing about it really are asking for us to push ourselves further and be picking up these different paradigms or really trying to integrate our thinking more deeply. So that said.
Okay. So because this was our independent study and because we are students in SLE, Cody and I also started looking at studies that really pushed themselves, as she said it, and looked at mixed methods or mixed methodology in their research studies. And the reason why we wanted to look at this was because a lot of constructs that we explore in second language studies is so multidimensional and it's so multifaceted and multi-layered. And without inviting or welcoming a mixed methodology approach, we would be like the people in this figure, right? Instead of knowing that they're looking at an elephant, they would think that they're just holding a rope, or it's a tree, or it's a snake, or a spear, or something. To step back and understand that it's an elephant that they're looking at, we need to bring together all these people's perspectives and try and look at the larger picture. And what we are saying is not new. I mean, we are awesome, but we didn't come up with this. There were already scholars in there. There have been several scholars in the field who've already mentioned this. And more recently, King and Mackey have called this the layered perspective in taking up different epistemological stances in looking at the research phenomena. And Richard Young more recently called it the habits of mind, about how as researchers we are socialized into thinking a certain way, and we need to take up mixed methods to expand our habits of mind and include other approaches in looking at the research phenomena. Okay. To illustrate our point a little further, we are going to today take up one construct in second language studies and look at it more deeply. Okay. We are going to look at L2 motivation, which has been researched and explored extensively in second language studies for the last 50, 60 years. It all started with Gardner and the work of Gardner and his colleagues in the 1960s, when they started working on L2 motivation, and they started developing the socio-educational model, which itself has evolved over the years through his work. Central to the socio-education model are two concepts, which is integrative motivation and instrumental motivation. I'm just going to briefly explain what these two are. Instrumental motivation is when learners are motivated to learn the language for an instrumental reason, like finding a job or getting into college and so on. Integrative motivation is on the other hand is when they are motivated to learn the language in order to integrate themselves with the target culture or with the target community to become part of that community. Okay, so there's a slight difference in that. In order to test that, they developed the attitude motivation test battery, which is a set of questions that can be used by learners or by researchers to find out the different aspects in the model regarding students' motivation. The goal of the socio-education model was essentially to establish causal relations between integrativeness, positive attitudes, and language learning effectiveness. Okay? So their epistemological origins was in positivism or in post-positivism. They did have a lot of social factors, individual factors, and all that, so they did cover a lot of aspects, but essentially, and they've been critiqued to a certain extent for this also, that their main goal was in establishing causal relations. Another theory that looks at L2 motivation is the L2 motivational self system, which again started with a critique of the socio-education model. Jordan and colleagues said the socio-education model focuses too much on the large picture and there's very less focus on the individual learner itself. So they, drawing heavily from psycholinguistics, developed the L2 motivational self system, and their purpose was also, their work has also been extensively in the qualitative field, methodologically, and they've tried to explore different motivational aspects in trying to find out how learners are motivated. The final model, or the final theory, that I'd like to talk about today is Norton's investment. So investment comes from a post-structuralist perspective, right? And she says that investment is different from motivation in that it does not focus on the internal motivating factors or influences, but rather focuses on the external factors that might influence how, to what extent a learner is invested in the language learning process in the classroom. So she tries to uncover the power relations between, for example, native speakers and language learners, the L1s of the language learners and the target language, or how the language is valued in the classroom or outside the society, and so on. So her goal or purpose in developing this theory is to uncover power relations between all these things. So we have three different theories that looked at the same elephant or at the same L2 motivation here. The reason why we also chose L2 motivation today is because we are going to look at one study that did take up that layered perspective or that mixed methodology approach in bringing together these different theories. So that is the dissertation work of Pamela Wesley, who incidentally graduated from our very own department some time ago. So she looked at language learning motivation among French and Spanish immersion students. So these were young adolescents who had graduated from immersion elementary programs. Okay. So to give you an overview of what her study was about, so she had three research questions. The first one is where she looked at what are the motivating factors among these students. The second was, how does our understanding of the motivating factors, what does it tell us about two issues that we find in immersion programs? The first is persistence or attrition from immersion programs, and the second is students' understanding of cross-cultural understanding in the immersion students. And finally, the third question was about how did she integrate these two findings together. Okay. And I've highlighted these here because that's what we are going to see in her data and how these questions were answered by integrating the findings. She had two data sources, student interviews and student surveys, which she administered using the attitude motivation test battery from the socio-educational model. And her analysis procedures were thematic analysis of the interviews and statistical tests on the surveys, and then integrating both these sources. Okay. So this figure from her dissertation helps us understand how she went about the analysis and how she brought together the different theories. So she had her quantitative and qualitative data, which she tried analyzing using the socio-education model, and then she went on to include all these other theories, investment, L2 motivation self-system, but also something that didn't fall under the motivation theories, the self-efficacy theory, attribution theory. And she used all these models to explain the persistence and attrition from immersion programs and how students' cross-cultural understanding was developed, and she finally had her integrated findings. Okay. So as you can see, she took her data through all these theories to land at her findings, essentially. So I'm going to do the same. I'm going to highlight how, or I'm going to show to you how she drew from all these theories and how doing so gave her a richer understanding of her data and of her participants and of the research problem. So the first thing that she found was instrumental motivation, if you remember, is from the socio-educational model, did not apply to the immersion programs. Because instrumental motivation assumes that the learners know what they are learning the language for, and immersion students, given the age at which they enter these programs, did not know why they were learning this language. So the socio-education model was not able to explain this finding or this part of the data that she had. Second, in her statistical test or analysis, she found that she found a contradiction. So she found that students who had positive attitudes towards immersion programs left the immersion programs, which is counterintuitive. Why would you leave the program if you're interested in it or if you like it? And this is where her interviews helped. So in the interviews, she found that the students left the programs because of peer relationships and because of the school environment. While this can be perceived as just mixing the methods or methods at the methods level, she also used to theorize this by not sticking to the socio-educational model, but by drawing on Bonnie Norton's investment also, because as you can see, peer relationship and school environment is still those external motivating factors, and it's not not just the intrinsic individual factors. Third, in her surveys, she found that students did not value the material motivations or the material resources that come from L2 learning, such as finding a job, again, going into college, and so on, which is explained by the instrumental motivation. She found that her participants valued the symbolic resources of L2 learning, such as improving self-esteem, self-efficacy, being respected more because you can speak another language, finding access to safe places because you know another language. So again, the socio-education model did not help her understand these data, but investment, the theory of investment, helped her understand and make sense of all this. Finally, she found that her students' understanding of language learning in an immersion context was off mark. They defined it in terms of traditional foreign language learning, whereas immersion programs focus on content-based language learning. So students did not understand that, so they have different and that influenced their motivation in a certain way. And again, the socio-education model did not have any place in it to explain this, but the L2 motivational self-system did. So in short, what she found was that if she had just stuck to the socio-education model in trying to make sense of her data, she wouldn't have been able to explain so many things in her findings or in her interviews or in her surveys. And by drawing on investment and by drawing on other things, she was able to gain a richer, deeper understanding of what was going on in her research context. Over to Cody.
You can go ahead to the next slide. Okay. So up to this point, we've been kind of elucidating how mixed methods can be used to reconcile what is thought of as irreconcilable, right? And some of the paradigms that I talked about even say it doesn't matter that there's this epistemological difference. We'll sidestep that, or we'll put them in dialogue, or they come up with these kind of other ways of thinking about it. And we do believe, as Anu said, that a lot of the constructs that we study and the different theories that we use can be reconciled. But we don't want to imply that we're saying that everything can be meshed together and that all of these theories can be overlapped and you can pick and pull how you please. And one of the areas that really stood out to me for that is this construct. You can go ahead all the way through it. And I don't even know what to call the construct, because by how you name it is going to give up your theory, right? So I was going to put something in the middle. I couldn't even think of what word to use, right? But so of either code switching or translanguaging, which we're familiar with, and my goal here is not to enter into this conversation or a debate about it, but rather that the underlying assumptions and goals of these two different theories, I argue, are really irreconcilable. That you either believe in some ways that language is one dynamic system in which you're drawing from different aspects of that repertoire, or you believe that there are separate codes. And those two beliefs, I yet have understood how you could look at data and reconcile those in certain ways. And similarly, the goals of these different theories in terms of research tend to be quite different, and I would say fairly distinct and hard to reconcile. So I bring this up just so that we acknowledge that we're not saying mixed methods is a panacea that you can now use to study any construct in any way. But there is quite a number of affordances that we think is the L2 motivation construct demonstrated, and other constructs that, or theories at least, that maybe are going to have to remain distinct, at least for the moment, until we come up with a third. Go ahead.
So nevertheless, we still found that studies that took up this mixed methodology approach offered a more holistic view of what was being studied. And Wesley's study has been touted as one of the great ones, one of the good ones. And another example is a study by Lee and Green that looked at academic success in ESL learners that also took this mixed, that combined different epistemologies and methodologies in studying their question. So we were interested in looking at, okay, let's look at more, let's find more studies, more work that does this, that mixes methodologies and methods. And we did some Google searches, and we found that there were not a lot actually. So we thought we'll go back to all those published journal surveys or meta-analysis that have looked at how many mixed method studies have been published. So here's one by Hashemi and Babai, who looked from 1995 to 2008 in 7 different journals on studies that have been published using mixed methods. And they found a total of 205 articles in 7 journals in 13 years. So 205 is a big number, but remember it's over 13 years. Okay, that's a lot of time. And 205 is not a significant or a substantial number. Another study which went from 2002 to 2011, it looked at articles published in over 9 years or 10 years. And they started with a keyword search, so they didn't start with specific journals, but they started with keyword search of mixed methods, and they found 18 articles published over 9 years in 13 journals. So 9 years and just 18 articles that said mixed methods. But they also did another search for quantitative and qualitative. So if the method section had both the words quantitative and qualitative, they at least mixed methods, and for that they found 21 articles over 9 years. So even if we combined the search for mixed methods and the search for quant and qual, we still have only 39 articles over 9 years in these 13 journals, which is still approximately 4 articles per year. So that's very less. And maybe we thought, okay, maybe the awareness is growing now and has grown a little more now. So we looked at, Corey and I decided to extend this journal survey or this journal search. And so what we did was we looked from 2012 to 2018, and we used the keywords mixed method or mixed methods. And we did not use the quantitative and qualitative that Riazi and Candlin did, because we were looking at mixed methodology and not mixed methods. And we looked at 10 journals in the field of second language studies, some, the most popular ones, the ones that we all read about and all that. And here are our results. So note that the y-axis goes from 0 to 14 articles. So all these 10 journals, note that they are even below 4. The only one that has a lot of articles published in mixed methods is the International Journal of Bilingual Education, Bilingualism, which has 12 articles published over the last 6.5 years. So over the last 7 years, in these 10 journals, we have 23 articles that mention that they've done mixed methods, which is a significantly less, it's a small number of articles given the proportion of studies that are published every year, right? So we thought, okay, so there must be some challenge or some barriers to doing or adopting mixed methods research. While we can intuitively think of some, we really wanted to go back to literature and see what have other people said about what the challenges or barriers might be in doing mixed methods. So we assumed we'll have a huge, when we did a Google search, we thought we'd have a huge list of articles, but we had 2. So there's really not been a lot of work done in exploring why people don't take up mixed methods research in second language studies. So the 2 articles that we found that did talk to people or that did think about what might be the challenges in taking up mixed methods, the first one was by Riazi and Candlin, and they said researchers either might not know of mixed methods research, or even if they did, they might not know how to combine them at the epistemological level about conceptualizing their research phenomenon as epistemologically diverse or as multi-dimensional, and bringing that down to the methodological level, right? The second article that we found was by Bryman. He did talk to 20 researchers coming from various fields, and he found that there are individual factors, research-related issues, and field-related issues that determine whether, or influence at least, whether researchers take up mixed methods or not. So we have less research in looking at why or why not researchers take up mixed methods research, and the first one did look at the field of second language studies, but it was an ethic perspective, and the second did have an emic perspective, but it was not specific to second language studies. So that's the gap that Corey and I identified, and that's where we are designing now our study. So we are trying to look at what factors influence whether or not second language studies researchers take up mixed methods, what are the methodological decisions, or how these methodological decisions that researchers take in our field are influenced, and how do these factors influence the methodological decisions that researchers in second language studies take. So following Wesley, we are trying to have one question that can be answered by our quantitative strand, one by our qualitative strand, and another one where it can be integrated together. And we are very thankful to the support of the department in helping us do the study through the Dale Lang Summer Award. So thank you for that. I'm almost done. So the study design, we are following a sequential study design where, if you remember, the results of one phase will inform the next phase. So we are planning to start on a focus group discussion where we will have participants or researchers from every strand represented in the focus group, and we're hoping to bring everybody together in a dialogue about what are the challenges in adopting mixed methods, and we will be analyzing this using qualitative thematic analysis. This will be followed by a survey that will be sent out to a larger population. And the survey, we hope to prepare the survey using the themes that come from the focus groups and by using Bryman's findings. So we're hoping to Bryman and all the findings from the literature. So we're hoping to bring together emic and ethic perspectives in creating the survey itself. And finally, if necessary, we will follow up this survey phase with another individual interviews if we find that one challenge or one barrier is largely represented in the survey, and then we hope to invite participants for individual interviews to understand more deeply why this is a challenge or not. So that's where we are right now. We are putting together our IRB protocol, and we hope to have it turned in, so stay tuned for our results, and we'll be back. Thank you.
Are there any questions or comments? Sam?
Well, I'll start by saying I thought this was a really great presentation, really interesting.
Thank you.
And the question on my mind right at the moment, and if you spoke about this, I apologize for missing it, but your conceptualization of second language studies, like, what are the boundaries around that? Right? 'Cause one of the things you have to think about right now is recruitment, and like how what falls into this bucket that you're looking at.
It's a great question and one that we've been dealing with and we're still dealing with as we work through the IRB also. We started with second language education just because that's what we call ourselves. But we realized that when the types of constructs we're thinking of don't necessarily fall into like teacher education. They could, but we're not going there. So that's one boundary that pushed us towards second language studies, that we're thinking more about SLA constructs as well as maybe some classroom practice constructs like L2 motivation or like teacher cognition, but that's kind of like teacher education. We're not quite sure. We're working on it. Did you want to add more?
No, just that at the beginning, as we started designing this was a conversation that Cody and I kept coming back to again and again, and we even talked to Martha about this for so long. Should we say second language acquisition, second language education, and then for a while we took up Riazi's term as language teaching and learning, and then we finally just landed on Kendall's and Alison Mackey's term of second language studies. So we are not sure yet about where the boundaries are.
And it does affect what participants we invite.
Yeah.
Yes, we're aware of that.
Yeah. Did you have a question, Yiru? I thought. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So I noticed, this is a small thing, but even in the Journal of Mixed Methods Research, they only had 2 articles that reportedly
Well, that
mixed method. Was that just like a data?
No, I think that was all the way back on the first one, right? Yeah, and so because Riazi and Canlin are just looking at second language, well, what they call language learning and teaching. So in the journals of mixed methods research, there were only 2 that dealt with language learning and teaching. Mm-hmm. Yep.
I love the meta level of using MMR on a study about MMR. Kind of Shakespearean.
Maybe a little, I just want to thank you for your presentation. It's super clear and interesting. I guess I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about not just why isn't more of this done, but kind of what do you feel like are the key theoretical or methodological issues that remain unresolved? I mean, do you feel like if you were to write a paper kind of summarizing where the field is, what do you think are the kind of key points of tension? Aside from there not being a whole lot of work, do you have any thoughts on that?
So I feel like increasingly there is a lot of dialogue or in the field itself by saying either there are no different camps, we are just trying to look at different factors, or that we are already doing this or we have been doing this. So if you look at all the different various AAA colloquia over the last few years, there have been at least 1 or 2 on this topic every year over the past few years. So it looks like there is a lot of acknowledgement and dialogue in the field that we have to be using this. Yet we found that there are not a lot of studies that take it up. So we didn't say this, but we are conceptualizing this as sometimes it's attributed to researcher socialization, sometimes it's attributed to researcher cognition, sometimes it's because of the demands of the field. We would even at some point, I know, thinking about talking to publishers as do you require certain kinds of studies being published in your paper? Sometimes it's mentioned explicitly in their websites, sometimes it's not. So we are aware that there are different challenges to doing this, but the tension that we feel right now in the field is that while everybody acknowledges this, there are very less papers or studies being actually published. So that's where I think the tension is.
Yeah, I want to answer too. I have a different answer than you completely.
Yeah.
Where I think one of the tensions goes back to those 4 paradigms that I was describing, and that it did I don't agree with all of the paradigms in some ways, but they did help me realize how, as I said, how much more nuanced mixed methodology is as a methodology. And so, like, Pam Wesley just talks explicitly about that she draws on dialectical pluralism, but that's not a term that I often hear at all in our field. And so I feel like a tension is that we're not familiar or ready or willing or whatever it might be to take up these other types of paradigms that would lend themselves to this type. It's really changing your thought process about what your own ontology is. And those aren't ontologies that are yet comfortable in our field, I would say. I'm not sure that I agree with them either. I mean, I have trouble with thinking about a continuum, but it's pushed me. Yeah.
So Sugas just has this special issue on SLA and World Englishes, and she really, the way she talks about it is that the cognitive and the social perspectives are like almost like different fields. She says, what is the common ground? In reading these articles, it's not always clear that the two disciplines were seen as complementary. So that is really dramatic, I think, to see like cognitive research in SLA and social research in SLA is like different disciplines. And I feel like that kind of takes us back to like the paradigm wars. You know, I don't know if that sounds old school to you guys, but it kind of does to me.
But that responds to the epidemic perspective that you found in those two articles. Like just the emic and epic perspective that you found in that two articles that argue or challenge debating the mixed methods and why we have like a limited number of mixed method studies in the field. But then I think the hidden messages behind the epic and emic is actually the constraint, the structural constraint that come from the epistemologies or ontologies at each field that we have in your field of SLE.
I was at a AAAL colloquium this year, and you know, I heard James Lantolf and Robert De Keyser, they were on the same panel, and they kept saying again and again. So De Keyser was saying, yes, we acknowledge that there is a social aspect to this, and Lantolf was saying, yes, we acknowledge that even though mediation happens in the social environment, it does take, there are some mechanisms going on in the mind that influence how these are processed. So they kept saying, yes, we acknowledge it, yes, we. So it looked like they were saying, yes, there is.
They don't want to do it.
They don't want to do it. Yeah.
Exactly.
I wonder
Somebody else can figure out how to
Exactly.
I wonder if this is because like the processes of cognition cannot be observable. Like, how would you visualize that?
Well, and that gets to your epistemology, and that's what I was saying, is that it does require being willing to expand your epistemology somewhat. Leah, you want to jump in?
I guess something I'm wondering about is like, who are these scholars that are engaging in mixed methods research, and how long have they been in the field too? Because you think like, I guess like maybe, I mean both young and older scholars like might tend to stick in their field. I know I tend to go towards the very qualitative and critical, so I'm just wondering who's behind the mixed methods.
And also it strikes me how different, because I'm doing a minor in educational psychology, and how different we are or how different the courses that we offer
Yeah.
in these two departments, right?
Right.
Right, so so if we are trained in this way or
Exactly.
that way,
Yeah.
then it shapes our
Absolutely.
methodology or our ways of looking
Well, we're not
at
trained in
studies.
mixed methods.
Right.
You're not, right, because you have to like go to a different building, right?
Right.
But you are very aware, like you have the dual lens, right?
I work with Tara all the time with qualitative study, and then I take classes with statistical analysis, all sorts of quantitative
And you've taken
stuff.
Connie's classes.
Yes, right.
On like how to think about reading.
Very
And
common.
you know all that work as well. But it's not like you're unaware of like the different lenses.
Well, and the methodologies in education versus linguistics
Yeah.
or languages are also different. I mean, I can
Yeah.
start right out since I've spent more time with folks in the College of Education. The approach to research is different.
Yeah.
you
Rich.
know, so,
Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
It-
So it makes it more complicated, right?
Yeah. At Iowa, Richard Young, his talk was about habits of mind, and he's publishing a chapter that's coming out, I think, in June or July. And the way that he was talking about it, which I found very compelling, beyond the whole socialization and habits of mind and all that, was this idea of tracks, and that as researchers we have like an attention track, and we all know that we do this, and we have to ignore other things because you have to focus your attention. And by taking up a layered perspective or mixed methods, whatever you want to call it, it just like widens that track just a little bit. You're still ignoring other things. You're always ignoring something. But that it's a way of thinking about your research as like widening that track just a little bit.
It makes it a lot more complicated.
Yes, of course. It's not easy. Yeah. Sim?
And I wonder how many of these studies are driven by teams of researchers with different training and backgrounds. And in my own experience of mixed methods is that, you know, a bunch of, like, a very qualitatively rooted project went and, like, found a quantitatively trained, proficient ally to join the project and help us design that piece of our study.
And that's something that comes up in
Yeah.
the literature, that's, you know, one of the barriers, or, you know, that it's so complicated to do it yourself. It usually has to be done in a team, and who has the resources to do it in a team, and how does that work?
And the skill, too.
And the skill.
To be able to do something quantitatively and
And it
qualitatively.
ends up in that, the one you talked about.
The
one
expansion.
that's the expansion.
It can be hard to
Yeah.
integrate it then if you don't, as
It's
one
almost
person,
like-
have it all in your brain.
Right,
Yeah.
it's almost like then they have two separate research questions too,
Right.
a quantitative one and a qualitative one,
Yeah.
and then it's still like two separate studies.
And then it's not very satisfying to any of the granting organizations that you might send it to, because they're usually also
Right.
polarized ones. So that might be one of the reasons these aren't getting.
Yeah.
So you're probably aware that like researchers are kind of over-researched. We all get requests for questionnaires or surveys probably every week. Have you thought about how you're going to get people to participate?
I can't participate.
Well, you guys like us.
Depends on your methodology. We've also been crying you're tainted by your talk.
Yeah.
Yeah, we
No.
might just be excluded now.
For the focus group, we were really thinking by contacting people whom we know and whose work is deeply rooted in certain epistemologies and bringing them together.
So the personal touch.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a good question, though.
Gabriella, did you have a question?
When you were talking earlier, I kept thinking about Preve, and so I just did a quick search in Spanish and was going to do one in Portuguese in a second, and I found a lot of hits, and that makes sense to me because of that way of looking at education writ large. But I didn't do the search on second language.
What was the search you did? I'm sorry.
Freire,
I
Paulo.
looked on the search of education. I just put in keywords education, Freire,
Uh-huh.
and what else did I put in? Methods, mixed methods, and I got a lot of hits. But that's on second language. So,
Interesting. Yeah.
Right, so in the workshop that Jean-Claude and I were in this year on mixed methods too, she said there's so much work going on in different fields that uses up mixed methods, yet in second language studies or in second language education we find so little, or so it's not taken up that a lot too. I just wanted to add something about our earlier conversation about these different epistemologies and reconciling them. One of the first things that we read was about these different paradigms, and we had this question about how are different epistemologies reconciled in mixed methods research, and we found that actually in the different paradigms they don't want to reconcile it, or like they're saying let's not even get into that question, let's focus on something different. That's why pragmatism gets at focus on the research question. Transformative paradigm says look at social justice, that is important, and if that means that we bring together different strands, that's what we do. So they weren't looking at bringing together the epistemologies or the ontologies. They were saying let's focus on what's important, and what's important can be different for each worldview in mixed methods.
Thank you all so much.